The other problem here, though, is a concept called interpassivity. Zoran could put us into this interpassive state where, because the problem is, this spectacle of him winning could be taken as, oh, great, I don't need to do anything anymore. I don't need to get out there and support him because he's going to do my anti-capitalism for me. And whether or not he does is obviously just a question that has to be left to the future. But it goes to the broader point that when you have fascism, when you have communism, you need propaganda with those things. You need to argue. But capitalism doesn't need you to believe it works for it to work. And apparently, according to this argument, fascism and communism are things that require you to believe them to work for them to work. So in capitalism and capitalist realism, you can have this state where I don't believe money is real, but I act as if it is. Or I don't believe this works, but I act as if it does work. Right? You get into this capitalist realism is this unique situation that produces that. And the danger of interpassivity is, whenever any spectacle comes along, like Zoran winning or the squad winning or Bernie gaining ground, right? The danger is that it can relax us into passivity because it's like we see, it's obviously the media system that we're not going, unless you're going in person to their rallies and hearing them speak, you're probably getting this information from the media. So you have a spectacle of anti-capitalism and you relax and say everything's good and you pay attention to something else. Hello, Pill Pods listeners. Today we're picking up on a topic we actually covered a couple years ago now, I guess it was. I can't even remember when we did our last episode on Mark Fischer. Mm-hmm. When we did Exiting the Vampire Castle, that was a bit of a different angle. But today we're going to capitalist realism, something I've wanted to read for quite a while. And never done it. It's not even that long. I don't know why.
Have you never? Was this your first time reading it, Eric?
It actually is. Yeah.
I'm really?
Yeah, I missed out on a few important texts. I know, and I claim to be knowledgeable about the sort of British Marxism type of stuff, but I guess this is one of the ones I missed.
It's like one of the only theory books that anybody's ever read.
I know.
That's true, it is.
Yeah, it's like the kind of theory book that gets a lot of people into theory. They're like, I think I can read theory now, and then they read Jameson. They're like, okay, I give up.
Yeah.
There's probably a good chance that many of our listeners this might be the only theory book that they've read, perhaps.
Yeah, so everyone can school me on it, because that's my first run through. But I mean, his style is quite familiar, right? Like, it is kind of eclectic, bringing in very different topics from pop culture, economics, politics, and drawing on like psychoanalysis and
also, if it's not obvious already, we're joined again by Tony from the One Dime YouTube channel and the One Dime Radio podcast to talk about this. So I just want to make that clear so that the listeners are aware of what's happening.
I know I'm blowing this introduction.
I'm the substitute teacher.
The substitute, yeah. Guest host at this point.
Please treat me well.
Yes.
Tony is a guest host.
Meaning we're going to put on a film for you, and that's going to be the class today. Substitute teacher, yay. Actually, exactly. Fischer does talk about teaching quite a bit, because I guess he is a teacher, or was a teacher, sorry, and he drew a lot of stuff on his experience. What was it? It was almost like a continuing education he taught in. It was like almost like an alternative school system where like working class families or people who didn't fit into the mainstream British school system, which I'm not familiar with at all, could sort of send their kids there. And
I think it was more like the British equivalent of community college.
Oh yeah,
okay. Yeah.
Kind of what he taught. Yeah.
Right. That makes sense. I was also going to say before Tony got here and before we started recording, Eric and I were sort of noticing that there's, it's funny that in the Exiting the Vampire Castle, he talks very like praisingly about Russell Brand, who I think was for a time like authentically a pretty left-wing guy, like talking about working class issues. And then I also added that, like, fun fact, maybe even some of you who have actually listened to the audiobook of Capitalist Realism, because it is actually read by Russell Brand. In the audiobook, in the audible version.
He's the narrator. Yeah, I mean, Russell Brand crossed the aisle not too long ago. Yeah, I think he was always genuine. I mean, and he was a bit, again, on like the more British cultural scene, he was big. And until he got into those big movies, but
he's trying to find some self-reflective answers. I don't know. That's
and the sexual harassment stuff. He probably, I don't know. He exited the vampire castle, but he turned right.
So what's the so maybe we should just get like the core thesis of the book on the table. I don't know if either of you kind of have. I mean, I can kind of give it a shot if you want. But Eric, did you like have a way into the core thesis, and maybe also why you wanted to read it? Because in this case, Eric actually chose the topic.
I suggested getting back to this text because, again, it was one I'm feeling the guilt of not having read it, even though it's such an obvious thing to read when you're in this area of. Anyway, yeah. So, capitalist realism. I wanted to read it at this time too because of Zoran's win and the kind of. I think it seems to me like the mainstream establishment Democrats, at least, are like those today who are most under the influence of capitalist realism. Because you kind of have like the anti-establishment right that seems to have taken over. And I don't know how they would fit into the capitalist realist argument. Maybe they do. Maybe you disagree, but they seem to be not there. And then Zoran also seems to be kind of like a anti-capitalist realist challenge from within. Anyway, it was just an opportunity to use some theory to meditate on an interesting development.
What's going on?
In democratic politics in the United States as outside observers. And capitalist realism, yeah, I mean, it's just very basically, it's the subtitle of the book, right? Is there no alternative? Which is asking that question that's rephrasing Margaret Thatcher's famous line, there is no alternative. Tina, there is no alternative to capitalism. And today, that problem seems to be very dominant, especially after the fall of the USSR, right? He's like, at least in the 80s, there was a clear actual alternative to capitalism. You say, okay, you can just point to, I don't know why everyone suddenly forgets about China after 1989, as if they stopped being communist somehow, but okay, anyway. The fall of the USSR, now there's no alternative, like for real, it seems. And you could argue China's pretty plugged into the global capitalist market despite its avowed communism. But
arguably it is an alternative.
Yeah, I mean, it's symbolically at the very least. But anyway, it seems like we're deeper than ever into this. And this Fischer text is also just a blast from the past too. Like I started university maybe not too long after he actually wrote this. And I remember 2008. I remember all that stuff, too, that he's talking about. I've seen those damn movies he's mentioning, most of them. So, I mean, it's also fun for me to get back to that stuff. But yeah, capitalist realism, it is a kind of subjective belief that there is no alternative to the capitalist order. It goes a bit deeper than that, too, because of the shift to Post-Fordism, which we'll have to get into, has almost created a new situation in which work and labor seem to be changing drastically, and our relationships with our jobs and our families seem to be changing very drastically. Things seem to be in flux quite a bit more than they used to be, and actually capitalist realism seems in many ways to pick up or provide an alternative way of conceptualizing all this to something like, say, Friedrich Jameson's the logic of postmodernism, or the logic of late capitalism. It's another way of talking about postmodernism with some different ideas about it for those who may be less comfortable with using postmodernism as a way to conceptualize all of these social changes over the 20th century and beyond. So it's not just like a simple, there's no alternative, that's the definition of it. It is a cultural and historical configuration in much the same way that postmodernism is when you use it in the way Friedrich Jameson uses it. So we can get into more of the specifics as we go along, but that's the general, that's why I was thinking about it. And that's kind of a basic, what is capitalist realism? What's Fischer talking about here?
Also, the kind of Zizek saying, it's like much easier to imagine an end of the world, right? Some sort of catastrophe than it is an end to capitalism. And like, so, and that's sort of like the way, and I guess like the fact that that's, assuming you accept that premise, the fact that that's true is like evidence of capitalist realism existing in our sort of social, political, cultural milieu.
Fischer kind of attributes this equally to Zizek and Jameson. This idea that it's easier to imagine the end of the world than the end of capitalism, which just and then he uses a kind of discussion of the movie Children of Men at the very beginning to illustrate this idea. But it just kind of goes towards the broader argument again of capitalist realism, right? Like if it's easier to imagine the end of the world, then there really is no way we can imagine an alternative, right? Like our imaginative horizons have shrunk in around us in a way that means we just kind of give up. It's like this situation we're in now where we don't actually believe in the ideologies that we espouse. We know it's all kind of just like cynical bullshit. And yet we act as if it's all true. Everything we're saying is true, and we act as if we believe in it. But that's what I was just saying, like Zoran makes these promises. In one sense, yes, he's a politician. They all want to win, and he's saying these things to win. Cynical disavowal. But on the other hand, like we should rally behind him because these are good things and we all want these things. And there's this sort of schizophrenia contradiction there between these two things.
I'm actually not convinced that rent freezes are a good idea. I actually think that's kind of a bad idea, but that's a whole other story.
Well,
yeah.
In any case, like the general message of affordability is something everybody can get behind.
Well, yes, that's crucial. I totally agree with that.
Please elaborate on that. Why are rent freezes bad is it like bad under a certain context or just in any context?
The problem with this is like housing availability. And when you just keep things artificially cheaper, you're just going to continue to increase demand. And it's actually just going to be harder to get an apartment, get anything.
You mean that you would reduce supply?
You're also going to reduce the incentive to increase supply.
So I don't know about the demand, but the supply is that can happen.
Do I think that there should be like other policies that like make rent freezes possible? Like, yes, I'm just saying like in a vacuum, in the current context we live in, doing a rent freeze is generally like not a good long-term solution.
Disagreeing with how we get there is not disqualifying you from having a leftist point of view on this still. But the general message of affordability is like something we still, even if we don't all agree on specifically how to get there. I don't think Victor secretly has like major real estate investments that he's worried about, and he's like hiding them and lying to us by saying, no, actually there's technical problems. That would be hilarious and ballsy if that were the case, and I'd love it. Not really, because I'd feel betrayed. But anyway, yeah, I think he's behind.
In New Zealand, there was a policy that was like a real failure, like when they had kind of the Labour government, where they started giving like first-time home buyers like a big tax credit and basically just like giving people more money to try to help them get a house, which sounds on paper like a good idea. But what happened is housing prices went through the roof because all of a sudden there's more people who have money to buy houses, but they're not actually building more houses. So therefore the price of houses went way up because everyone was trying to buy into the market. So like you need more than just like one policy in isolation. Like you need to do more than just give people money to buy houses. You need to increase the supply of houses.
You could definitely do rent freezes. It's just not a long-term solution.
That's what I meant. It's not a long-term solution.
But you definitely, it's not like it's catastrophic.
No, I don't think it's catastrophic the way that policy in New Zealand was.
But like commodifying the housing market in general is probably more long-term issue. But yeah, sorry.
Capitalist realism?
Yeah, we should pivot back to that.
Yeah, I can bring it to that. Just I was surprised you want to talk about this book because I was thinking of like this is the one book that's probably talked about too much on the left. In fact, it's so I knew that this book was something unique when a few years ago I would see people's Hinge profiles like have capitalist realism in it sometimes. it was like one of these books you would see people just
Really?
quote
On the dating app?
Yeah, well, what I mean is like you would find normies, quote unquote normies, or people who aren't really into theory like that, who would know about this book and kind of like it. I think there's a few
Their signal
reasons
that
for
they're like, I'm kind of into theory. They just have like capitalist realism quote.
Which it is very accessible.
It is very
which
accessible.
a virtue.
Yeah, and I think the other thing about it is that it really is like Jameson, Zizek, and I would say parts of Christopher Lasch kind of distilled in this more accessible format, although Christopher Lasch is very accessible, and I think he's much better, to be honest. But like, this book is good. I mean, it resonates with people, I think, because of the examples when he talks about, like, in university, how there's this, one idea I remember resonated with me a lot was this idea of depressive hedonia as opposed to adhedonia, which, like, traditionally you can get diagnosed for not being able to, like, feel pleasure. But he thinks the sort of zeitgeist of a lot of young people is actually this inability to not feel anything but constant pleasure. It's like an addiction, but a kind of numbness as a result of that. And how he would see people in his classes like wearing headphones all the time, even if they weren't listening to anything.
Yeah.
You know what I mean?
Yeah.
It was just this obsession with always wanting to be distracted. So it resonates in terms of
that
like,
part resonated with me, definitely.
in terms of what it says, you know, there's the kind of obvious, like, people can't imagine anything outside of capitalism, but I think there's other aspects of it that are more interesting. I don't, you know, I'm curious what you guys' favorite chapter was. For me, it's Marxist Super Nanny, the chapter 9, I believe.
Yeah, the last one, I think, yeah.
Marxist Super Nanny has a point that I think gets at something a lot of other left authors, except the likes of Zizek and maybe Lasch and Jameson, get at, which is actually this idea of Marxist Super Nanny is this idea that, you know what, like, the left has defined itself about freedom for so long. But what is capitalism's big strength? It's like constantly giving people things that they want, but not giving them what they need, right? It's giving them what they want, but not what they need. And what is the left's role in this? Is it to, like, accelerate the wave of capital by, you know, more opening up more windows of freedom and, you know, desire? Or is it actually to kind of be like, hey, you know what, protect us from what we want and give us what we need? Like, this is the whole point about the Super Nanny. The Super Nanny, I should really probably elaborate on this. Super Nanny, for those who don't know, is this TV show in Britain, which was basically about this, like, very menacing big super nanny woman who would be called in by parents who had no ability to, like, manage their kids, and their kids would be total delinquents.
Oh, shit.
Misbehaving, just like
a Mrs. Doubtfire type of thing?
Yeah, exactly. Like, kind of just like eating 10 chocolate bars a day, won't want to listen to their parents, just video games. And usually it would often be like single mothers who need to call in, or very, what I would say, permissive liberal dads, soy dads, dare I say, who would, like, be featured in this, who would be calling in
beta dads,
who would be calling in the super nanny to go manage the kids. And she would bring in this, like, really harsh discipline, but, like, in a way that would work, not just like mindless, you know, not like just beating kids or something, but just effective discipline that would put the kids' life in order and get them to actually listen, because you need that for kids to grow up, like some level of obedience, right? And he thinks that's emblematic a little bit of capitalist culture, and then how it kind of destroys our discipline and willpower through constant consumerism, and how it's in the system's interest to do that, and how if a lot of people seem to actually kind of crave, and to some extent, like, I feel almost like I'm free, but in ways that actually hinder me. You know, Byung-Chul Han gets at this a lot, like how now we're masters of our own exploitation, and how maybe actually there's been a collapse of authority, but in a collapse of authority except for, like, capitalist hierarchies. But in all these other arrangements, like the family, there's a collapse of authority, collapse of communal authority, religious authority, and all that's good for capitalist interests to kind of colonize everything. And I thought that chapter was great, and I wish it was longer, because I wish he took that logic to a bigger conclusion, because I think a lot that goes over a lot of people's heads, and that's stuff that Lasch in the Culture and Narcissism has been saying since, you know, first book was in the 70s and then the 80s.
In a way, I'm not surprised that it goes over people's heads, because it does suggest maybe some conclusions that are traditionally associated with a more right-leaning, or at least right-leaning analysis of culture. I mean, Christopher Lasch too, like for those of you that don't know listening, is someone that, I think that if you actually read him, it's not really like clear that you can just say he's a right-wing figure, but the right has co-opted him like recently, like the right wing, like the post-liberals have kind of like taken a lot of inspiration from Christopher Lasch. But like, I think I'm tempted to say that Lasch would even likely reject that characterization, but I don't know.
Well, his daughter does actually very much dislike the way he is used by the likes of Steve Bannon, because Steve Bannon claims to be influenced by Revolt of the Elites. And when you think about that, it's not hard to see how. But Christopher Lasch saw himself as, he described himself as a socialist in economics and a small c culturally conservative and small c culturally conservative, but socialist on economics. And he started off as a full-on Marxist at the beginning of his career. So he has a kind of historical materialist look at things. And he's been critical of both the left and right. Like, he'd be critical of the right for not really proposing like material solutions and really speaking to superstructural things, and the left kind of actually having like weirdly capitalistic views on some like sociocultural stuff.
Like desire and enjoyment and all that stuff, right? He's kind of a critic of kind of like liberal, like hedonism, basically.
Yeah.
It's interesting that you brought up Byung-Chul Han as well, because I definitely, while I was going, some of the parts definitely brought me back. I was like, Burnout Society, there's definitely some big overlaps between self-exploitation that Byung-Chul Han talks about and the kind of self-surveillance that after he brought up Deleuze, after Mark Fischer brings up Deleuze and that postscript on Control Society, he brings up this idea of self-surveillance, like you're internalizing these mechanisms that were once sort of, seems like they were outside of you, that you're being performance evaluated. Your performance at work is, for example, or in an interview, is being evaluated all the time, and there's a big complicated system that requires. Ironically, as we move deeper into neoliberalism, the anti-government ideology par excellence, we end up with more and more layers of hierarchy and bureaucracy. Go figure, Fischer points out. But one of the things we end up doing also is internalizing that performance review kind of structure. So we end up self-monitoring. And that reminded me of kind of Byung-Chul Han's argument about like what we do with cell phones and the way we have to move from like a negativity of almost like cynicism towards ever achieving anything to like this overabundance of positivity, like work, and work is never done, exploit yourself. Like a paradigmatic influencer or something, the longer they step away from the computers, the more chance that they're going to fade into irrelevance. So they kind of have to be, and people are literally just burning out, passing out on the subways and stuff like that. There are some elements of that, I think, in here, but more of a materialist analysis as well, because it is all pinned down on, I mean, one of the big tectonic shifts he points at is the movement from Fordism to Post-Fordism, which is a little more, maybe one of the more obscure things in here that people won't be quite as familiar with.
Do you want to outline that transition from Fordism to Post-Fordism, just for the listeners?
I know, I immediately regretted bringing that up because now I'm like, oh shit, I'm gonna have to fucking, oh my god. So obviously it's named after like Ford himself, of car fame, where you have a physical factory and you have an assembly line and loads of employees and kind of a very clear work structure. But actually, he dates the transition of Fordism to Post-Fordism. What was it, like October 1979 or something like that, where there's this shift. According to, I'll just read it here. According to Marxist economist Christian Marazzi, the switch from Fordism to Post-Fordism can be given a very specific date, October 6th, 1979. It was on that day that the Federal Reserve increased interest rates by 20 points, preparing the way for supply-side economics that would constitute the economic reality in which we are now enmeshed. And what I got out of this was the movement towards much more. This word flexibility comes up, and these flexible supply lines, on-demand manufacturing, supply lines that are ready to sort of shift and break and pop up somewhere else, rather than having these very stable, secure, long-term supply lines. You also have, the offshoring of a lot of works, and the diversification and globalization of all of these like logistics lines too. So like Japan is one of the big, and the Japanese car industry is one of the big pioneers of like on-demand shipping, for example, where you have very, very carefully timed and tuned supply lines. You don't just have these big factories with like tons of like parts in them anymore. Everything is on demand, on time. Everything has to be tightly regulated. But then at the same time, this flexibility creates a load of instability too. And so Post-Fordism is kind of this move towards also markets where it's not about a stable commodity. It's about, creating new desires, shifting to accommodate what consumers are saying. And by the way, people are more considered as consumers now. We're very used to being referred to as consumers, which is kind of a post-Fordist type development.
I would say probably the simplest way I could think of explaining Fordism and post-Fordism is just the transition from a producer economy to a consumer economy. Like the Fordism is just, assembly lines. It's a country where you're exporting goods for other people to consume, whether it be weapons or whatever, materials, cars. Like America was producing more than it consumed for a while, and you could say the ideology of that was more what Weber might call the Protestant work ethic, which is, you should be a little bit more austere. You shouldn't consume too much. You should work hard. You should be disciplined. But then the shift from a consumer economy, which comes with world trade and globalization, and people are consuming more. And now the main way for people to get rich is to sell stuff to Americans and first world countries like in Britain, France, Canada. And so, with that, you get an ideology that changes. Like you get, this is the base and superstructure thing with Marxism, is like when capitalists have a means of getting rich one way, ideologies are going to kind of shift in ways that benefit that. It's not really like conspiratorial. It's just that, obviously it's going to mesh together just due to the nature of the interests. Like, what ideologies are better for a consumer economy? One that doesn't tell you to be guilty about consuming, one that tells you actually should be guilty for not living your best life, for not consuming. And that's the kind of, but you also get like these sort of liberation movements on the left. There's a constant debate between the like proletarian feminist wing, which I support, and the sex positive wing of feminism, which is more like, we should like legalize all sex work and let's do all that. And which I think accelerates the trends that have got us here. Kind of, that's a whole other topic. We don't have to go into that. But what I just mean is like a lot of the ideologies, I think more people, when they have issues with the left, they have issues with certain sociocultural tendencies. And that comes out of the 60s, which comes out of this post-Fordist transition, right?
You're accelerating the process. If I'm hearing you right, Tony, right? Like that's kind of what you have in mind, that like, so it's not necessarily like about whatever, like legalizing prostitution in specific, but just like it's an example of something that is like that you see as consistent with this pattern of just like commodifying kind of like desires.
Right.
I mean, one of the big features of post-Fordism is kind of like a gig economy type, as opposed to like the stable work that, I don't know, I guess like grandparents now in this generation had. This kind of stable work, paying into a pension, having this kind of company that lays out the path before you a little bit, and maybe you probably have healthcare through your company and all that. We move much more towards like a dual income gig economy, where work is contractual and expected to be temporary, and you're not the company is no longer expected to, have your back on healthcare and pension and all these other things, like the so-called sort of nanny state did or forced them to do, the kind of welfare state idea, or at least like a kind of corporate welfare state type of consensus. Post-Fordism kind of does away with that. And that's also connected to this flexibilizing of supply lines, this offshoring, this of production, this transition to a consumer economy. And he even talks about, being in this sort of, I guess, community college-like system where he's seeing kids coming in from families that now have overworked dual income parents, and the parents have a lot less time to spend with the child. So he's saying the kids I'm seeing seem to be almost less and less socialized because they haven't had that attention that a single income sort of Fordist family could afford for them. Post-Fordism makes it a lot more demanding to even have a family, which he says is ironic because neoliberalism depends so heavily on the factory. The family is the factory of the consumers that need to buy the products that are being made.
Yeah, I caught that too in the book, where I actually didn't like that. Because he kind of uncritically went with what is a very popular view in leftist academia, which I think popularized kind of by Wendy Brown, is this idea that neoliberalism actually pushed the idea of the family as something to replace the safety net. But, that is taking Reaganist rhetoric and the right-wing faction of neoliberalism, because that's what I think this point of view ignores, is that there is very much a left-wing faction in neoliberalism. There's both a right and a left faction in neoliberalism. And they'll say, yeah, of course, the right will sometimes say the family is the haven in the heartless world. I mean, that's not that's actually a Marx quote. But this idea of, says that about religion, though. But the family is this thing that will replace, that should exist, but the welfare state should be abolished. But the thing is regardless of what anyone says, is the family was just declining. You see a broader decline of the family, regardless of what's happening. So it doesn't really matter. What I think is actually the overall just factual trend is that Post-Fordism saw a decline of the family. And I think people who throw in that stuff, which is the neoliberals wanted to keep the family. No, it's that they were more they weren't idiots, and they knew that if you threw people off the welfare state, there would be consequences to some extent, and that they preferred the family over, the welfare state, whereas the left would often prefer the welfare state over the family. I think we should have support both. I think both are pretty damn important. Yeah.
Worrying about the integrity of the family lately has been more of a right-wing talking point in more contemporary politics of today.
Unfortunately.
And I mean, I think his broader point is kind of correct. I mean, especially for the latest generation where again, the affordability crisis also makes having a family much more difficult and expensive. And of course, but the right tends to take this criticism and say the left is against families. the postmodern neo-Marxist culturalists are actually directly opposed to any kind of family.
But they do say abolish the family. They just envision this idea of a communal structure, which is basically the pre-nuclear family structure of the tribal communal structure, which, it's just not they don't support family. It is that, how are you just going to abolish the family and go to that structure? And they'll say, well, it's possible because there's been past arrangements. And it's sure, but how do you get there in this modern state? And, most people think that it's going to be the administrative state. And if you look at the way the left talks about childcare, the radical left, because a lot of some Marxists support it, a lot of anarchists support it, and some academics, left-wing progressive academics support it, but it's not a really popular position.
I think everybody is worried about whatever version of the family, whether it's the very traditionalist heterosexual nuclear family of the right, where you're not allowed to have gay parents or anything, or the more, I think, ample versions you find on the left. Everyone is kind of worried about what capitalism means for the family structure, which it's connected to the move to post-Fordism is really what I wanted to say. All these different phenomena are connected there.
Yes.
Post-Fordism is like the movie Heat compared to like older gangster movies like The Godfather and Goodfellas are like the paradigmatic Fordist situations, because in The Godfather and Goodfellas you have this very traditionalist ghost of the old world Italian gangsters with these family structures and these hard one value system that holds their almost slightly mysterious and ritualistic kinds of hierarchies in place, as opposed to Heat, which is just like a bunch of guys who are doing a job and aren't really like connected to anything, and not clearly not part of a family, because at one point one of the characters wants to get married and one of the crime bosses is like, how do you expect to help me if you're tied down with marriage? Like the idea of like rootless criminals who have no attachment to place, and they're much more on a he kind of just compares those. The Heat is like analogous to the difference.
Part of the thing in this book that I always felt was maybe incomplete or taken at two face value is the structural explanation for mental health. I guess that it's like oh, like it's like the capitalist economic, which like I think that plays a role, but it's like not the actual mechanism. And I do actually feel like maybe the family is like an important kind of question here that again, and I've said this before on the podcast on past topics, that the left is maybe not equipped enough or like too wary because of how conservative right-wing coded talk about the family is.
And religion.
Yeah. And when I really do feel like just saying, oh, like it's because capitalism is so toxic and it's not giving us the things that we need, that's why we're all depressed. I just don't think that's an incomplete story.
Yeah, because we have to work. That's the thing. The way they take it is like, oh, capitalism makes us depressed because we have to work, and it's like,
I mean, in some cases that's true.
Part of like capital. Well, the thing about Marx, like remember what Marx was saying. He said capitalism creates alienation, not that it makes you depressed. Those are different things. I mean, alienation does like limit your humanity, and it kind of dehumanizes you in some way, but it's not like, he's not saying capitalism makes you want to kill yourself. Like the rise of mental illness is really something unprecedented that we've been seeing, and it's to act like it's merely as a result of people now just being open about it. Like, I mean, that's completely utter bull. Like the fact that you have such high depression rates and suicide rates in the most rich countries, may I add. I think Byung-Chul Han takes Mark Fisher's analysis to a more strong conclusion. Like Byung-Chul Han talks about the family, but he also talks about religion and decline of rituals, where he says the decline of religion has not been completely an emancipatory process, because while we can say like organized religion was really repressive and some of the superstitions of some religions were very backward and unenlightening, he thinks the core strength of religion is rituals, and rituals are something that are actually good, and that is very much missing in the capitalist society. And I think he goes as far to say that is the cause of depression, and I think that's certainly part of it.
It is interesting that he brings up the mental health crisis, because that has been seeing a lot of attention, especially in universities in the last couple of years. This like sort of, and obviously we got a good dose of it in COVID as well. The mental health epidemic, the hidden pandemic it was called at the time, or something like that. And not that I'm laughing at it; it's a serious thing. Having an ADHD diagnosis myself, and then reading a line that runs something like attention deficit hyperactivity disorder is a pathology. It is a pathology of late capitalism. I'm like, yeah, I'm late capitalism, man. Produced by money slamming together in a Hadron Collider. And then I popped out, and also my mother and father, but they're inconsequential to my birth. No, I mean, I take his point. These are depression and ADHD and mental health are conditions that are obviously neurologically instantiated. It's not like the scientists who are studying these things are just crazy ideologues hallucinating genes and cells and brain activity, but these sorts of things are also reflective of, I don't know if he asks this in the right way, like obviously they're biologically instantiated, but what causes them? Like, what is their cause? And obviously the answer will be, well, like ADHD for specifically is one of the most genetic things they've identified. Like out of anything, if you see someone with ADHD, like there's a huge chance that like one of their parents will have it too. It's very heritable. So that's how they would answer. But he's, I take his point.
To play devil's advocate, one could, like, you can definitely say like that ADHD, the traits we associate with that we call ADHD are genetic. But the classification of ADHD is a result of capitalism, I think, is more what like Fischer would say, given that, like, think about it, like, why is ADHD a problem to be diagnosed? Because it makes you, like, the only reason why any pathology is ever really created as a pathology is because it renders you unable to effectively integrate into the existing society. When in the case of ADHD, it's like, it's not like it doesn't make you violent. It doesn't make you completely dysfunctional. Maybe, I guess, but like it's just like, maybe you're not as productive as you should be.
It's a bit of emotional regulation problems.
Yeah, or you're not as productive as you should be also, right? Which is more mundane.
Oh, I have so many days where I'm like, I'm going to get everything done today. And then at 8 o'clock, I'm like, I did nothing today. In fact, I undid some things I did yesterday. But no, it's the problem of separating, I guess, historical processes from sort of like the scientific style of explanation, right? Like we know things like heart attacks are modern era diseases because, well, people simply just died more often than they would reach the age where heart attacks became. And then once life expectancy goes up, you have new diseases to deal with. Or once the refrigerator is invented and we're not curing all of our meat, okay, like now stomach cancer is going to change its distribution. And it's the problem of separating kind of, I guess, subject and object in that sort of way too. Is like, okay, well then is refrigeration the cause of heart attacks? Like, it doesn't, yeah, of course there's like, there's lots of different ways to explain those sorts of things. And ADHD and depression are examples, but then, it's no coincidence that you have this like massive pharmaceutical company. I remember the last time they changed my ADHD medication. I can't remember if I mentioned this. I'm not on it anymore, but last time they just changed it on me without asking. And I looked at it, and the factory was located in Israel. It went from a factory from Sweden to a factory in Israel. And then I was just like, and they didn't think that like asking me about this.
Wait, so it's the same medication. It just happened to be one that was made in Israel now?
It was a generic that they started offering. So once a generic comes out, when there was no generic before, your insurance company says, we're not going to cover the normal one. We're only going to cover the generic now. And apparently sometimes the pharmacy will just switch you on to the generic without even telling you. So then suddenly your medication's different. And I looked up the factory that it was being made in. It wasn't Sweden anymore. It was in Israel.
You'd rather support those blonde Swedes than those Jews in Israel?
Yes, definitely that's what I was getting at. And and also all of it's connected, these material developments of science, history, culture, society. Obviously they all interact, and it's really kind of crazy to try to separate and isolate these things. But yeah, anyway, getting back to
well, I want to bring it back for sure to sort of like the capitalist realism, and maybe like how we can use this to think about contemporary stuff. I mean, this was originally inspired partly by Erik's observations about the reactions to Zoran's win in New York. But I guess like before getting to that, I also I've been meaning, and I wasn't sure where to fit it in, just to comment about the sort of thought experiment that I've mentioned before that I've used with students about, it's easier to imagine the end of the world. I guess I just want to start by throwing a little bit of cold water on that, because I guess it's not surprising to me, if you think about it, why it's easier to imagine the end of the world, because it's simple. Like, it's like an asteroid hits the world. It's not complicated. It's like people are going to die. Like there's going to be droughts. Like, it's not like the things that could destroy the world are relatively simple. Mass destruction is like not complicated. Making sure that everybody has like a good material means is complicated. Like that's why it's harder to imagine, because it's actually complicated. So I don't know if you guys disagree with me, but I guess I just think that the fun thought experiment is actually like not as revealing to me as it seems, because to me it's actually not a mystery why it's harder to imagine alternatives, because it is actually a very complicated problem, whereas destroying every human on the planet Earth is not that complicated.
It is certainly like a catchy little slogan that really drives the point home. It's easier to imagine, and our cultural imaginary is definitely much more jam-packed with disaster films and climate and zombie and plague and whatever other ends of the world's kind of imaginaries.
Even the conversation we've been having now, like we've sort of been talking about the balance between, and Tony, I think, brought up really like interesting stuff with regard to Christopher Lasch and just sort of this, like the fact that, okay, like if capitalism is just about satisfying desires, well, it's no wonder that there's going to be some sort of emptiness to that. So then we've sort of been dancing around this idea that, we haven't been framing it in terms of alternatives, right? But there's a way in which our conversation was sort of talking about, well, what do we really need in our society, right? And I think chapter 9, I guess, is sort of on to some of these ideas that, well, we need some kind of paternalism, some sort of way to encourage more discipline or something like that, right? Because just giving people more of what they want, i.e. to satisfy their sort of hedonistic desires, well, that's not really going to do it in a way, because, I mean, it might help, right? Like, I mean, just giving people stuff, but maybe like the more fundamental problems that Fischer is talking about in this book, well, we're not really just going to solve them necessarily by just giving people like more liberal freedom in the sense of just more or more hedonistic freedom. And then, so like as my point of bringing that up and rehashing that is like, we are noticing the complexity, because there's like so many like competing interests and desires and concerns about like what actually constitutes a good life that's worth living in a society. What's a thing that constitutes a good society? Well, maybe it's rituals and patterns and family. I mean, these are, like I'm saying, these are complicated problems, right? This is not like imagining an alternative that addresses all of those things that we've been talking about seems to me to be actually like a huge puzzle.
My idea with this, thinking about Zoran, was just that, well, clearly, like conservatives disagree, and and they would say it's very easy, apparently, for them to imagine the end of capitalism, because Zoran apparently represents a threat, because he's being called a communist. I think, like just recently, Trump was just agreed that he's a communist and was going to look into deporting him, and like Homeland Security had a meeting about him and all this shit. Like, there's some panic going around. And so apparently for them it is easy to imagine the end of capitalism, because a New York mayor could end capitalism, apparently, by the way they're reacting. But that's the point, right? How do you distinguish their rhetoric from the reality that they're not talking about a reality at all anyway? As far as Zoran can go, he's just going to be able to draw a happy face, which is fine.
So there's this tendency, and I've talked about it with other people on my podcast, One Time Radio, and it's this tendency for the left to affirm or support something that inadvertently either is accommodative to capitalism, benefits capitalism, or affirms something that is already happening under capitalism. A good example is this authority question, like the family. Arguments you often hear in favor of abolishing the family or against the likes of, Byung-Chul Han's view, or the likes of Christopher Lasch's view, or just anyone who wants to defend the family. They'll say, well, the existing family is oppressive, and that sometimes, if when kids don't have, real freedom, I mean, their parents have custody and all that. If you have a bad parent, you're fucked. And now they're not wrong about that. However, their solution is to look at broken families and to say, you know what the solution is? We should just do away with the family. And I think it's silly and naive because, yes, this is something that is bad. Like that, some people have really bad luck. In fact, a lot of the people who make this very argument come from broken families, which gives them a sort of bias in the matter, where they'll say, you know, if they'll project what is really ultimately a family trauma onto their politics. And I think, damn, don't ruin it for the rest of us. But like, also, it's just not a great solution. What I think we should look at is why, not that we should get rid of the structure necessarily, or like, I don't think there's only one structure, but that we should think that we're wise enough that we have figured out this clear alternative to like the family structure. I think, you know, you have to be really careful before you embrace the politics of like, you know, let's get rid of that. I think the real thing is
deconstruction, a society of just deconstructing everything, deconstruct gender, deconstruct family. Like,
yeah, we should look at like, okay, we should have better authorities. Like that's the question is we should help families so that we have less broken homes.
Don't get rid of binaries, just have better binaries.
Well, I don't know if I'd go that far, but like, actually, you know what? I'm pretty against the gender binary, but that's another whole topic.
Well, I just meant in the sense of like these authoritative, like ways of thinking about things. That like, it's not that there's a problem with like authority per se. It's just a problem of like the type of authority.
Some people think there is.
Yeah, some people.
Many people think there is. In fact, like, this is a kind of streak you find in Wilhelm Reich's sort of view. Wilhelm Reich was this guy who thought that the family was oppressive.
We covered him, didn't we?
Yeah, we talked about him a couple weeks back.
Yeah, the family was oppressive. It gets people to obey authority because the family is the first cell of fascist society.
Oh, yeah. Holy shit, I forgot about that.
What he's right about is what Hegel kind of says in the philosophy of right is that the family is the first cell of the state. And unless you think you can live with no state, then you'd think that view is ridiculous. I think the idea of like
the family is where ideology is shaped for Reich, I think.
Yeah, but this is the kind of thing. This anti-authority, this blanket anti-authority politics. It's
just having sexually repressive parents. What's more authoritarian? Oh yeah.
A lot of people who find themselves attracted to politics that are, you know, against all authority as such, and often you see this a lot in the way some of the left intellectuals who are on this sort of side like to use Nietzsche. They like to use Nietzsche and kind of forget about his aristocratic hierarchical politics and just take the kind of anti-authority part and, you know, embrace that. Kind of like Deleuze does this, actually, you know, and how he uses Nietzsche. And a lot of the people who find themselves attracted to this sort of thing, they think in their own shoes and that's it. They think, well, you know, I can be a free thinking individual and I'm perfectly fine without any, you know, authority structures. You know, what's to say that everyone can be like that? And it's like, one, you're probably an adult. Two, if you were a kid, this would be bad. Three, also, not everyone is like you. This is the thing. A lot of people who are intellectuals get attracted to this politics because they are by default people who are inclined to this sort of free thinking, free spirited view. Not everyone wants to be like that. Not everyone wants to be like that for everything in every matter. Like, I'll give an example. I'm very like, you know, forward thinking, free thinking on political matters, intellectual matters. But when it comes to like, I don't know, deciding where to eat or deciding certain things, I prefer other people decide. I love it when people decide. You know, I love it when someone who like knows their shit about something just goes and does it.
Last night I decided we go to Patois.
You know,
which is a good Jamaican Asian fusion restaurant in Toronto. Anyway, okay, sorry.
You just doxed everybody, dude. Yeah. But anyway, the broader point here is about authority. I don't think authority is inherently bad. I really don't. It's a matter of better authority and the outcomes that it leads to. Some people who find themselves attracted to like just anti-authority politics. It went well with neoliberalism, partially because, you know, when you get this crackdown on the welfare state that comes largely from the right, starting already with the 70s, but you have, like, at the same time, the new left's politics is so anti-bureaucracy, and part of that's, you know, legitimated, like, part of that's legitimate, and that there is a real critique of bureaucracy. but have this like libertarian politics that actually meshed very well with the new spirit of capitalism. The new spirit of capitalism was all about getting government off your back, about delegating stuff to the market. And I think sometimes, man, like, because I never found the systems of the Soviet Union appealing. If I was alive in the 60s, I could see myself going from a, new leftist to a, neoliberal. I mean, a lot of lefties became neoliberals. That is a fact. In fact, there's this book called The Left-Wing Origins of Neoliberalism. That's about how a lot of like people used to be like full-on Marxist Soviet sympathizers. And after they got disenfranchised, they thought, well, you know what? Maybe the market is the way to a freer society, maybe even a socialist society, because you have like this, it's more liberating than the state. And we look back on that like, oh, that's like, I would never believe that. But I don't know, man, the way the left has I would call like the dominant form of feminism today, market feminism. Gender ideology, this idea of choosing a million genders, it's so marketized. Think about it, like the marketplace of genders, the marketplace of ideologies. I don't know.
That's a tough one. That's a tough one. I think there's a difference between...
You're scared to agree by the woke mob?
Oh, I think there's a difference between trying to like analyze what's going on in any of these situations and then advocating the distinction between facts and values, which can never really be separated. But it's not like every time we're describing something, we're also advocating a very specific solution to it, right? Just like what opened us up with the housing thing, right? Like we would all agree on affordability, but maybe not all of us would agree that freezing housing prices is the pathway to affordability at least in where housing comes into it. But I think also, saying, okay, all these genders and it reflects some kind of market ideology. And then even that, what's the problem with that? There's a certain level of analysis lacking that I can't agree or disagree with statements like that, because I just don't know where the fuck they're even coming from and what the problem is in the first place. But anyway, that is to say, I don't know the answer to the gender stuff there.
Yeah, I guess, do we want to talk about Zoran a bit? Like, because I'm, as a student of as a doctor in the philosophy of political science, I was looking into it. What power does the mayor have in New York? In general, like for the mayor to be able to do any of his core policies, he would need at least some funding authority from the state government. And the governor, I forget her name, Hochul or something like that. Maybe I'm mixing it up. She basically said like she's not going to increase taxes on anyone. Like she just said, and because she's been asked, like, are you going to do the things that are necessary for like him to implement his policy to, for example, create like childcare in New York City? Like he would need to appropriate like funding, and the only way that he can do that is by going to the state capitol. And so I was just saying like that's not going to happen. So like his core policy is just not realistic. It's not because I'm not in favor of them. It's just about like the institutional reality that like that there's only so much that the New York mayor can do. I mean, maybe he can. So to freeze rents, so I know that there's like something called like the rental rate like review board in New York City. And the mayor does have the power to appoint those members, but the mayor can't directly like freeze rents. He would need to get that board to agree to freeze rents. And he's not allowed to fire people from the board unless it's for misconduct. So like he would have to he would have to find an excuse to fire all the members of the board. And then implement his own who are going to promise to freeze rents. So it's just like, those are just like the kinds of fine institutional details that I was looking at. And I was like, well, his platform's just like not going to fucking happen. So.
And no matter how much he feels like kind of a breath of fresh air and a real turn in at least like municipal politics or even a real turn in politics in the Democratic Party.
We need a new system, and Tony will agree with me. We need sortition.
The other problem here, though, is a concept called interpassivity that comes up here in this text. And interpassivity, well, he's talking about the film WALL-E, but it's a broader point, right? So he says about it that the film, it is a great film. The film performs our anti-capitalism for us. It's an eco-catastrophe movie he brings up. So, and it's a great film, and he has some criticisms of it. But what he wants to get out is this concept interpassivity, which means capitalism, the film performs our anti-capitalism for us, allowing us to continue to consume with impunity. Yeah, and so this is the problem you even get this even from more like Marxist, like more even like more hardline leftists. Is like, well, I'm against Zoran because he's not like radical enough. He's not a true Marxist. He has critiques of capitalism, but they're critiques from within capitalism, blah, blah, blah. He's not enough, and he's ultimately damaging because he's going to perform. I don't know. That's almost seems like he could, and Victor's skeptical attitude may then be appropriate here, is that Zoran could put us into this interpassive state where, because the problem is, this spectacle of him winning could be taken as, oh, great, I don't need to do anything anymore. I don't need to get out there and support him because he's going to do my anti-capitalism for me. And whether or not he does is obviously just a question that has to be left to the future. But it goes to the broader point that when you have fascism, when you have communism, you need propaganda with those things. You need to argue. But he's saying here, the role of capitalist, this is a quote, the role of capitalist ideology is not to make an explicit case for something in the way that propaganda does, but to conceal the fact that the operations of capital don't depend on any sort of subjectively assumed belief. Capitalism doesn't need you to believe it works for it to work. And apparently, according to this argument, fascism and communism are things that require you to believe them to work for them to work. So in capitalism and capitalist realism, you can have this state where I don't believe money is real, but I act as if it is. Or I don't believe this works, but I act as if it does work. Right? You get into this capitalist realism is this unique situation that produces that. And the danger of interpassivity is, whenever any spectacle comes along, like Zoran winning or the squad winning or Bernie gaining ground, right? The danger is that it can relax us into passivity because it's like we see, it's obviously the media system that we're not going, unless you're going in person to their rallies and hearing them speak, you're probably getting this information from the media. So you have a spectacle of anti-capitalism and you relax and say everything's good and you pay attention to something else. You go back to you resume your Lord of the Rings movie or whatever you were watching.
Yeah, it's such a performative ritual at this point, like in art galleries or a lot of these artistic events where people will say, and then that's why late capitalism. I see with a lot of video essayists, it's strange. Like there's this interesting thing where like BreadTube started, like this category of BreadTube is this fascinating thing on YouTube because it includes a lot of channels that frankly aren't very political at all, but every now and then, and they're like 3-hour-long analysis of Harry Potter or whatever film or video game, they'll say something late capitalism, and it's almost like a ritual. And that's the disavowal you mentioned, like this fetishistic disavowal, which is to be like, yeah, I acknowledge it, but whatever. Zizek talks a lot about this, how like the way in which Mao's China would deal with criticism, like in dissent. He quotes Mao at a meeting how he would say, okay, guys, whatever criticisms you have of our party, just shit it out, let it out like a shit. And the way describing it like a shit, like just get it out, like just out of the way so we can move on, life as usual. It is kind of the way we treat like sometimes like our ritualistic anti-capitalism, it's like, okay, yeah, it's bad, whatever, not think about it.
Capitalism itself is the biggest purveyor of anti-capitalism.
Yeah, capitalist anti-capitalism.
Like movies, music,
art,
the cultural sphere is full of anti-capitalist messages. Reality shows are a good example of all this post-Fordist and capitalist realist stuff too, because reality shows are something that are affected by what they say, which is an interesting situation. So it's like what you say is real also somehow affects what is real. And I guess the point is, you can have a reality show and then the audience can react, and you can incorporate audience reactions back into the supposedly realistic and unscripted show. And there's a feedback loop between what people are saying and what is happening. And then so what is real in that circuit? Like it becomes a little less clear. and that matches the point too of interpassivity and the fact that capitalist ideology doesn't require a case to be made for it. In fact, capitalist ideology works best when you're not making a case for it. And so you can behave in whatever way you want, as long as you believe this is all bullshit, then you can still do it. And I'm sure every Silicon Valley capitalist is like that, Oh, I know money is completely just paper and worthless, or just bits on a computer now, if you're talking about those people. But I'm going to conduct my life as if getting as much of this shit as possible is the most important thing. So there you go. That's,
my prediction is you're going to get a huge return of trad culture, but it's going to be super commodified and ironic, and it's going to be totally ineffective. It's going to be a bunch of people who are like, I'm a trad cath now. You already see it with the likes of like Red Scare podcast, where they're like, they consider themselves to be trad cath, but are they really though? And, people who will like flaunt the kind of like crosses, but at the end of the day, they'll do the same stuff and nothing will change. Capitalism will continue.
Do you think there's going to be any growth of real trad? Like, do you think that your generation's going to have kids sooner? Mm-hmm. Like, are Zoomers, do you think Zoomers are going to have kids maybe sooner than millennials?
I don't think they'll have a choice. It's not like they can barely buy a house.
Yeah, that's true.
Forget having kids.
Yeah, so the trend will continue.
Look, I have friends who have master's degrees in like in engineering and chemistry and like really, you would think employable degrees, and they can't even find a job. It's crazy.
Yeah, true.
I would expect the family structure to continue to be challenged under capitalism, as Fischer's saying here, as we're seeing. And I would not be surprised if trad came back, because a lot of what trad is just kind of playing house, right? Like very traditional family roles, childbearing, stay-at-home wife, breadwinning father, like kind of this nostalgia for Fordism. It's a Fordist fantasy. I'm sure it'll get stronger if things continue in the direction they're going.
Yeah, I agree. I think that's interesting. Well, I think that was a good episode, guys. Thanks for listening, everyone. And you'll catch
thanks for indulging my choice.
Yeah, it was good. I think if we really never talked about or never covered capitalist realism on an early episode, I'm glad we did. And even if we did, it was probably appropriate to revisit it. Tune in next week for Kim Jong-Pils to be back, back in the driver's seat. And do check out Tony's YouTube channel, One Dime, and his podcast, One Dime Radio. And yeah, we'll leave it at that. Thank you.
Yeah, we should thank our guests for joining us. Thank you for
thanks,
props
Tony.
for that.
Hell yeah. Hell yeah.
Right,
I was a substitute teacher and didn't get bullied.
Yeah, exactly. All right.
Win-win. All right. Ciao.
Stop recording.